Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our 37th Russia-Ukraine dialogue, the series we started following the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. We are part-funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this crucial panel titled "The War's Ongoing Impact on the Western Balkans." Today, we gather to delve into the intricate and multi-phased repercussions stemming from the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war and its profound influence on the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans, a region with a complex history and diverse set of challenges, has found itself at the intersection of global geopolitics. The data we have at hand paints a vivid picture of how the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has cast its long shadow over this part of the world. It is a region where historical ties, ethnic and religious diversity, and complex political landscapes intersect with the strategic interests of major global players. Our aim today is to provide clarity on the complex web of relationships within the Balkans related to ongoing conflicts in the Western Balkans. We will shine a spotlight on the secessionist efforts within Republika Srpska, the challenges of the enduring Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and the implications of these issues in light of the Russia-Ukraine war. Moreover, we will explore the responses of Western states to these regional developments and their broader strategies in the Western Balkans. To set the stage for the discussion, let's reflect on some hard facts derived from extensive information we have at our disposal. In Serbia and Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as many as 89% of Bosnian Serbs, I apologize for that. In Republika Srpska, as many as 89% of Bosnian Serbs had a positive view of Russia's role in the country as late as autumn 2022. And recent polls demonstrate that half of a year into the war, so that was last year, 52% of those polled in the Republika Srpska admitted to supporting Russia's actions. The Western Balkans' reliance on Russian oil and gas has been a critical factor in the region's relationship with Russia. And as of now, Russia continues to provide nearly 100% of gas imports for Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This energy dependence has allowed Russia to exert significant political influence in these countries. Additionally, Russian television stations RT and Sputnik disseminate propaganda through their Serbian subsidiaries, while Serbia's domestic propaganda machine often echoes the Kremlin's stance on various issues, including the Russia-Ukraine war. So as we embark on this discussion, we encourage you to consider these factors and more. Our panel of experts will share their insights and analysis on the ongoing impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on the Western Balkans, providing a nuanced understanding of the region's complexities. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to a productive and enlightening discussion. And I'm going to first turn to, let me first introduce our panelists. Dr. Dimitar Bechev is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Meliza Haradinaj. She's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Kosovo. And last but not least, I'd like to also invite or welcome Dr. Kurt Bassuener, co-founder and senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council. And I should add that each of these individuals have a host of other titles and affiliations that are very impressive, but you can look at their bios. I'm going to first turn to you, Dimitar, if you would like to unmute for me, please. Dimitar, welcome. What are Russia's primary objectives in the Western Balkans, and how has the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war shaped its strategies and priorities in the region? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, and I apologize from the get-go for the background noise. I'm in downtown Brussels, and there's work in progress, as often is the case around Europe and the heart of it. Russia doesn't have any positive agenda in the Western Balkans. Its main priority for a long time has been to make life difficult for EU, but also NATO, and to put a spanner in the works that's very distinctive from its policy or overarching strategic goal in the post-Soviet space, where it wants to be the top dog, wants to reintegrate at least the Slavic-speaking, the Slavic ethnic parts of the Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine, into a revamped Russian empire in the Balkans, especially former Yugoslavia, which is far away from Russia's borders. The game is to exploit vulnerabilities and to score points against the West. How does 24th of February change this or doesn't? I don't think there's a change of strategy, but I'll submit that in my understanding, Russia has much less bandwidth to deal with anything beyond the war in Ukraine. Of course, now we're talking about Gaza, about Russian footprint in Africa and other issues. But I mean, Russia has a bigger fish to fry with the war. And I don't see Russia being involved. And I'll also, maybe getting ahead of myself, say that Russia has lost some leverage because of the risks associated with dealing with Russia. And I can go into details later in the conversation.
Thank you, Dimitar. I think that was a great opening, and we'll latch on to some of those issues that you mentioned. Meliza, let's turn to you. Welcome again. How would you describe Russia's relations with Serbia and with Kosovo? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you for this discussion today for a topic that has haunted the Western Balkans for many decades now. And finally, we're seeing its tooth grinding towards the Western Balkans and threatening in unprecedented, if I may, for this century, in unprecedented ways. I don't think there is a more accurate phrase that describes the relations of Russia with Serbia and Kosovo, other than Kosovo serves as a border between West and Russia, having Serbia as its main proxy in the Western Balkans as a neighbor. So this depicts perfectly on what the situation is and how Kosovo is trying to protect this border and to protect this influence expanding via a new association or Republika Srpska 2.0. So it's a well-recognized fact by now that Putin's hopes, Russia's hopes, are to slow down the Western Balkans' Euro-Atlantic integration and create a situation of chaos and ethnic violence and try to exploit that afterwards to weaken the West and to make sure the Western Balkans doesn't get closer to the EU or NATO and weaken the NATO's loose ends. And we know that the loose ends are in Bosnia and Kosovo, which are not yet members, NATO members, even though Bosnia is a member of a Partnership for Peace program. So I think there's also Russia exploiting the possibility of a potential ground for expanding the Russian influence as well, as I said, via a second Republika Srpska in the Western Balkans, so that Serbia is currently pretending to form in Kosovo. So this way, Russia and Serbia will expand their epicenter of influence and would endlessly then use, as they use Republika Srpska in Bosnia, use Kosovo and use an association with executive powers as a backdoor to endlessly destabilize not only Balkans, but also continental Europe. So Serbia's role in this meddling remains central and instrumental for Russia in the Balkans. So it serves as an irreplaceable tool to undermine the prospects of a still pending agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. And Belgrade's response is, of course, in support of Putin, in closer coordination with the Russian Federation, and also Vučić thinks that his close ties to Putin entitles him with a license to act with impunity, to manipulate the West, and to endlessly condition the EU and the West generally, and by making false promises of aligning with the West and with the EU. And a testament to this closely united coordination between Serbia and Russia, and I will conclude with this, is also a person, just as an example, Dejan Vujic, who is a close friend of Serbian President Vučić. And I will share a photo of him right now. So you can see, so he is seen here in 2012 with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, and then he is also seen fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine, also in the Donbas region. So this also serves as an undeniable link of Serbian mercenaries and fighters in Ukraine are closely connected and coordinated with the Serbian head of state. So in contrast to how Kosovo is and acts, we can see that officially there is no relations between Russia and Kosovo. As I said, we continue to reject any influence and any destabilization efforts that Russia does via Serbia as its proxy. We also have a resolution 1244 in force, which is a zombie resolution of 1999, and which is enforced only because Russia and China use their veto against Kosovo, not to protect Serbia, but to protect their influence in the Western Balkans for any positive reasons. So I will conclude with this and build up in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Meliza. And I'm not sure if I missed it, but Kosovo, of course, has instituted, has followed the EU in terms of sanctions with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war, whereas Serbia has not. Kurt, let's turn to you,
yes.
Because, of course, Republika Srpska continues to be quite a thorn, not only in Bosnia, but also it has an impact that reverberates around the Balkans. So let's talk a little bit about Bosnian Serbs. What motivates Bosnian Serb leaders to maintain strong ties with Moscow? And how do these ties influence the broader political landscape in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. I mean, I think that there's a mutual utility to that relationship, particularly between Dodik and Putin, but between RS authorities and Moscow. Dodik is easily Putin's most valuable player in the Western Balkans. Not the most powerful, but the most tightly and individually linked to him. And there's a linkage with Viktor Orban, who is his most valuable player in the European Union. And that's where some financing has come through. Russia hasn't really come through for Dodik in terms of money all that much. So it's valuable in both directions. And while Russia's ability to exploit things after February 24th last year has diminished somewhat, the utility of that tool has risen. It's at a higher premium because of trying to keep the West on its toes, and it works. And it works in large measure because the West allows it to work. That's the problem. What Minister Haradinaj said regarding Kosovo and Serbia, Kosovo and Bosnia is true, but NATO has missions, military deterrent forces in both countries. So in a lot of ways, it's more empowered than it is in the NATO member states to prevent things from going wrong. And that in Bosnia is a real problem because we're in a deterrence failure. So the implications are that Russia has a premium to poke its finger in the West's eye, and the West has allowed it to, largely because their main value is on pacification for the region, not just stability, keeping it quiet. And that works for the people who could destabilize it. So that's the game that's been played, and we've allowed ourselves to be played. So Dodik's going to keep doing it as long as he can. And that could be stopped very quickly if there were the will to do so, but there hasn't been.
Thank you, Kurt. And I think one of the things, if I read between the lines, what you're also saying, you know, on the one hand, you're saying Russia's ability to influence has diminished. You know, if you look at how Russia is overcommitted in Ukraine and in terms of its economy, but the issue, as you also allude to, is that influence cuts both ways. It's based on supply and demand. And there is a huge demand in the Balkans, in some parts of the Balkans, of course, for Russia to play a very active role. And that's what you see in Republika Srpska and in Belgrade and a few other places. Kurt, you wanted to respond to that.
Just a two-finger. Yeah, Russia's built a constituency. That's what the term that I would use. And it's used these media tools, and but it's always plugged into the mainframe of governments. And that's the way. And unfortunately, Serbia is the hub. It's also the hub for the Chinese, but that's a different story. But that is something that Russia has exploited. Our hope that we could wean Serbia away from Moscow.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I encourage any of the panelists, if you have dissenting voice, to, when I call upon you to, you know, please make that clear. I welcome any form of debate or discussion. Dimitar, I'm going to turn back to you. You know, we talk a lot about Russia in the Balkans, and we seem to have a much stronger understanding of Russia's relations with certain actors or states in the Balkans. But what about Ukraine? How would you characterize the relationship between Ukraine and the Western Balkan states? Thank you, Dimitar.
Well, Ukraine is a bit distant from the Balkans, especially the Western Balkans. If you enlarge the region to Southeast Europe and take Romania and Bulgaria, then it's a different story, because the Odessa region is next door. But with former Yugoslavia, I don't think there's much of a relationship. In the 90s, of course, Ukrainian peacekeepers took part in NATO missions. And there's some economic exchanges, but it's only recently that Ukraine has come on the radar, I suppose. For those of you who follow the region, you might remember in August, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis hosted a meeting of the leaders of the Western Balkans, except for Edi Rama. It's a separate conversation. But what's significant to me is that Volodymyr Zelensky turned up there, as well as the Moldovan President Maia Sandu. So because of enlargement now, increasingly Ukraine and Moldova as frontrunners are packaged together with the Western Balkans, which has good sides and bad sides. And that will be the case going forward. And come to think of it, it's not as new probably, because Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are part of several other EU-centric institutions and initiatives. Energy community will be one. What happened with visa liberalization in the Western Balkans was reproduced in Ukraine. So there's some connections. One constraint for Ukraine, I see, and it concerns Kosovo. Ukraine hasn't recognized Kosovo's independence. And probably it will be difficult for them, but I see a lot of sympathy in Kosovo for obvious reasons for Ukraine. So the war might actually alert lots of people in Ukraine about connections and similarities. So that's certainly a space to watch. I'm sorry, it's a convoluted way to answer your question, but there's some initial thoughts there.
No, I think it resonates also with this idea that we don't pay that much attention to these issues, but two, as you've pointed out, there's not much noise on that front either. But inevitably, because of what's happening now with EU enlargement talks and those kind of things, that Ukraine will more and more be lumped into some of the discussions that Balkan states are taking part with. So perhaps it sends a message also to Ukraine that they would have to start to create policies on the Balkans and do more thinking on that front. And I'm definitely going to press Meliza later on about the issue of Ukraine and Kosovo. But first, Meliza, let's turn back to you. How would you say that February 22 impacted the dynamic specifically on the Serbia-Kosovo conflict. I'd be very interested because there have been both some positive and very negative developments also on that front. Thank you, Meliza.
Sure, thank you, Leon. No, undoubtedly, Serbia has intensified its attempts to sabotage the Republic of Kosovo after the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. And in addition to what has traditionally done against Kosovo, like lobbying small states to withdraw or withhold their recognition of Kosovo, issuing arrest warrants via Interpol for Kosovo Albanians, manipulating media channels with racist propaganda and inflammatory rhetoric as well, also preventing Kosovo's accession to the international mechanisms. But it has also started to invest heavily in building, training, and maintaining a ruthless criminal gang in the north of Kosovo that it continuously incites violence and intimidate the local underrepresented Serbs who are disobedient to Belgrade's policies. So for better understanding, I want to share with you a simple graph that I prepared, and it depicts perfectly how Serbia has gradually or rapidly, saying in the last 2-3 years, and especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, intensified its terrorist acts in Kosovo. So I will share with you in a minute the graph. I hope this is okay. Is it visible to? All right. I have a problem hearing you. Maybe that's okay if you can hear me.
Yeah, you can. Yeah,
all right.
You can just enlarge in this parts that you want to point out, I would say. Thank you.
All right. So what you can see is in 2021, in blue, you can see the only propaganda and hate speech, graphs, pro-Russian symbols, and disinformation. So there were no terrorist attacks specifically, no terrorist acts, if I may. So in black, you can see the terrorist acts and also the acts of seizing weapons by Kosovo police, also burning cars of disobedient Serbs, attacking police officers of Kosovo, and also NATO peacekeepers. In green, you can see Serbian army maneuvers bordering Kosovo. These are all public events, events that are reported in the media. So I just put them here to depict, to have a clearer picture of how they intensified after the February 24 Russian invasion in Ukraine. So in blue, as I said, propaganda, hate speech. In red, you can see political activities, mainly coordinating with Russian embassy and also coordinating with criminal gangs in Kosovo. So as you can see, in 2021, we've seen only Serbs putting barricades in the north of Kosovo and also displaying Putin's photos in the barricades. Also in September 24, a Russian spy was uncovered under a journalist cover, but it's still under the blue highlight, which is still under the propaganda disinformation acts. Then you have the barricades, Serbia raising the combat readiness as well, and the Russian ambassador in Belgrade visiting the Serb military troops in the border near Kosovo. So you can see that in critical events, Serbia always turns to Russian ambassador to coordinate and to find answers and act together as one. So after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you can see that actions intensified. So we have immediately, within a month, Vučić meeting Kosovo Serbs and Radojčić, the criminal that executed the aggression against Kosovo. We also we've seen the public display of sympathy and support on President Putin. Also the meetings with Vulin and with officials in Russia, and also many symbols, the Z symbol appearing in the barricades in the north, which is a clear link to the gangs in the north and the Russian mercenaries, reportedly. Also, we've seen the burning of cars, campaign, intimidation of local Serbs. I'm not sure if you can see here. I cannot zoom more than this, I think, on these events. So in 2022, mine barricades, paramilitary Serbs and members of Wagner appearing in November, December by the end of 2022, and Serbia again by the end of the year, raising the combat readiness of their military in the border with Kosovo. So this has all been done when Serbia is surrounded by NATO members and continuously purchasing armed systems like Panzer and Kornets from Russia while being surrounded by NATO members. So who are going to attack with those attack systems while being surrounded by NATO members? And we should also not forget the fact that Serbia is part of the Partnership for Peace program with NATO as we speak. Even after the aggression it has committed and it has executed against Kosovo a month ago, it still paradoxically is part of the Partnership for Peace program. So this might also give a food for thought on how the West is responding to Serbia's aggression, continuous aggression, and coordination with Russia in the Western Balkans, but in Kosovo North mainly. And in 2023, we can see continuously intensifying terrorist acts. We've seen in May masked Serbs appearing in the north of Kosovo, wounding NATO peacekeepers with firearms, and also in a month ago, September 24th, wounding 3 and killing Kosovo policemen in the line of duty while they were preparing for a crime of aggression, orchestrated, trained, and executed by the criminal gang led by Radojcic, which is deputy chairman of Lista Srpska, the main political party in the north of Kosovo, which aimed to keep and to hold the monopoly of political representation of the Kosovo Serbs in the north. So you can see that after the invasion of Ukraine, instead of limiting or diverting the dangers and threats of a new conflict emerging in the Western Balkans, we've seen the total opposite. We've seen the intensification of the terrorist acts, of coordination with Russia, and of building and investing for a new spillover effect and a new second leg of the Ukraine war in the Western Balkans, mainly in the border between Kosovo and Serbia. Thank you.
Thank you, Meliza. And it's interesting because those who follow different Russian telegraph channels have pointed out that Russia has warned in previous months that things were going to heat up in the Balkans in October, and they marked the month of October. It really makes you wonder what would have happened, had those policemen in Kosovo not stumbled upon this group of what I would call terrorists, at least. I think calling them criminals is kind towards them almost. But it does make you wonder what could have happened had they not been discovered, and whether those spoilers would have been used in a manner to create serious instability, not only in Kosovo, because it would have spilled over into the region. definitely I agree with you that September 2021 definitely was a turning point, and that what many perceived as a small scale border dispute about number plates could have was the starting point of this sort of intensification of tension between Serbia and Kosovo. I'm going to turn to Kurt again, and thank you for that graph also, Meliza. Kurt, several leaders, I should say, and pundits have called for a negotiated solution between Russia and Ukraine. I did my PhD on mediation, and so you would think that I'm inclined to always push for mediation, which is what I normally want to do. But I'm very skeptical when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. I should say that up front at this very moment. But what war termination lessons can we learn from Bosnia and Herzegovina? Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you.
Well, I mean, briefly, you don't want a Dayton peace agreement. You don't want anything like it. You don't want entities. You don't want anything like special relations with neighboring states, which was built in actually for Croatia, but has been used by the RS in Serbia subsequently, once we took our eye off the ball starting in 2006. You don't want federalism, which, to be clear, Dayton does not create a formal titled federal state, but it's often that's used as a descriptor. And people who use that term use it knowingly, because federal units in Yugoslavia had a right to secede. My colleague Valerie Perry, I'm going to share a screen very briefly, and I'll tweet the link to this. So she wrote an extensive article about this pretty early on in the war, for Just Security, that gets into all the ins and outs more than I think we have time to do. But you don't want an inconclusive end. You don't want Russia to have any continued purchase on Ukraine. And I also think that it's highly unlikely that the Ukrainians would allow anything like that. I think to the West's credit this time, as opposed to 30 years ago, we are a lot more united and clear, with all the asterisks and caveats we can add. It is a very different policy stance of the West toward the Russian aggression to Ukraine, against Ukraine, than finally, and it took a while from 2014 on to get there, but than we ever were regarding Bosnia. And I think that that's why you ended up with a Dayton, because essentially we stuck to the 51-49 agreement that the contact group made with itself the year before the end of the war. And they didn't want to renegotiate amongst themselves, regardless of the facts on the ground. So the facts on the ground are going to determine a lot, which is why affecting those is the most important factor in my view.
Thank you, Kurt. I think there are so many lessons when it comes to Dayton that Ukraine definitely needs to avoid. But there are also some of the aspects with regards to transitional justice and the lack thereof that I think Ukraine will definitely learn from how things were done or not done in the Balkans that are also quite important. Dimitar, let's turn to you again. To what extent? Let me ask you, in terms of the since the February 2022 escalation of the war, what changes have we seen in terms of Russia's energy relations with the Balkans? I know that the EU, for example, put together this €1 billion energy support package. So I'd be keen to understand how this changes Russia's ability to influence the region and what that package looked like. Thank you, Dimitar.
Well, at certain level, there are no changes because Russian gas continues to flow to the Western Balkans. Serbia is the main customer, and there is a 3-year deal that Vučić oversaw. And if there is change, we have to wait for a little bit. But the rest of the region doesn't consume that much Russian gas. There is marginal change on oil, in the sense that NIS, the national oil company in Serbia, which is controlled by Gazprom Neft since 2008. So some reshuffles now, Serbian government recovered some of its shares. So Gazprom Neft doesn't have a controlling stake. And because of the sanctions as well, the refinery has to work with non-Russian oil. The oil pipe through Croatia, through the Adria pipeline is not Russian anymore. But again, this is not much of a alteration, because even before this didn't rely exclusively on Russian supply. In the future, we'll see greater changes, I think. First of all, there is new gas arriving to the Western Balkans, thanks to the expansion of the Croatian LNG terminal. There is also the Greek terminal that is coming online later in this year, or maybe early 2024, that will become available also to parts of the Western Balkans, thanks to interconnector pipeline that Serbia is constructing. So even Serbia might diversify away from Russia, with all the caveats, because you have a lot of vested interests in Serbia gas who want to do that. And one final remark, and there's actually two things going on that probably people in the Western Balkans haven't quite noticed. Last week, Bulgaria slapped this extra fee on Russian gas transfers through the third stream pipeline, which will make the economics for Gazprom a bit more problematic, because they have to, the cost of shipping gas is going up. But Russia will be unable to pass that, at least contractually, to Serbia, because Vučić managed to negotiate a fixed price. It might pass it to the Hungarian consumers. And Russia, once Ukraine shuts down the pipeline, which is next year, will become even more dependent on the Balkan routes to supply gas to whatever customers remain in Western Europe, including in Austria. So these are important things that will affect Russia's ability. And I think also the big picture in the region with energy, irrespective of the aid you gave, is the Balkans is really dependent on coal. These are coal-based economies. In a place like Kosovo, it's over 90% coal these days. In Bosnia, 70%, Serbia, something like that as well. But coal is difficult to exit from, because it creates dependencies, vested interest, and the EU will be pushing more and more going forward for decarbonization in various ways. I'm happy to elaborate further. The region hasn't partly been able to leave coal also because the gas option was never available. Russia never managed to supply sufficient volumes at a good price. But that has to change now because of EU pressure. And we'll see a lot of reshuffle in the market on the way to green transition, which will mean lesser dependence on fossil fuels and by extension lesser interest or lesser dependence on Russia too. So yeah, I mean, right now, again, to sum up, it seems that not much has changed, but there is a big wave coming on the horizon. It will affect the Western Balkans as much as it affects the rest of Europe.
Yeah, feel free, Dimitar, to elaborate on this issue of decarbonization, because it seems like many groups criticize this EU support package for its lack of focusing on decarbonization, and it's also seems to be mismatched with what's already in the region versus what is possible in the medium to long run. I noticed earlier this week that there were some Montenegrin civil society groups, for example, also that sent a letter to the European Commission asking the EU not to back, for example, the construction of a new LNG terminal at the port of Bar, exactly because they're not dependent on gas, really. But then this project will force them to build this long-term project and then set up infrastructure that they don't currently have. Is this the EU being tone deaf, or what's going on here?
I think there are all kinds of ideas, but I mean, building an LNG terminal is a costly and risky enterprise, and I don't think Montenegro has the financial muscle. I wouldn't put much credence unless they, of course, manage to find a strategic investor. Thing is that Croatia has correct capacity, can be doubled, and that will supply the rest of the region. There is an interesting Bosnian dimension. Of course, Kurt must have followed this as well, with the southern interconnector running from Split to Mostar and eventually to Sarajevo. So you could foresee a scenario where actually Croatia becomes the gateway and Bosnia reaps the benefits. Plenković was last week in Sarajevo. He promised as much. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing. But I mean, I might be surprised pleasantly with Montenegro being able to get off the ground such an ambitious project. Right now, Montenegro, as well as Kosovo, don't consume any gas. Albania consumes small quantities, but those three gas is pretty much irrelevant. Serbia is the main piece of the puzzle in this business. And again, Serbia gas is run by Dačić's Party of Serbian Socialists, SPS, as a fiefdom, and they're in bed with the Russians. They don't want to change anything about the business. And also Russia owns parts of the grid in southern Serbia, Yugorosgas. So if EU is serious about transforming something, it has to start actually with Serbia, to put pressure on tracking down the monopoly, Serbia gas, encouraging Vučić to actually, beyond this 3-year period, to start buying or exploring alternative deliveries. And also, bigger picture, tackle the elephant in the room, which is the EPS, Elektroprivreda Serbia, the main utility company. This has to be disassembled, unbundled, as it were. That will create disruption in places in Serbia the same way it does in Bulgaria or Poland or Romania. So one thing the EU has to do, really, I mean, there's many things on the agenda policy, but Western Balkans have to be included in all those financial instruments dealing with compensating regions where you have this disruption, the so-called the just transition instrument. In other words, places like Kobara, Pančevo, they need to receive investment into reskilling, into building new facilities, converting some of the coal mines into solar factories, and so on and so forth. But most of all, EU needs to make coal expensive in the Western Balkans, as it has become elsewhere. I mean, Bosnia now exports 50% of its electricity because it's cheap. You can send to Serbia and to Croatia and further afield. But if coal is expensive, that will be a signal to market players to start investing more into solar wind, where Western Balkans have an advantage. And once we repurpose the Western Balkans energy system, which is coming inevitably one way or the other, there'll be less space for Russia to play this energy card anymore. It won't be the end of corruption in the energy sector, because lots of governments and people will have green corruption and they will be giving projects to their cronies. But that might be the price to pay for moving away from fossil fuels, which is not just about Russia, it's about the economy of the region and about further development and integration into the EU.
Thank you, Dimitar. So there are opportunities. The question is just whether we're going to squander it, you know. But I think one thing that's striking is that a lot of these big energy projects often require something at scale, something that would involve the region. And we're not seeing the region having discussions about energy security as a collective, because everything is so balkanized, in a manner. At least that's from
sorry to interrupt you. There's two things there. Just one footnote. I mean, Meliza would know that Albania and Kosovo have extensive cooperation. So Albania supplies Kosovo because of its hydropower, and likewise Kosovo in times of shortages in Albania does. So it's not without, and of course Bosnia exports electricity. So we shouldn't overstate fragmentation. But it's certain that if green policies are to be phased in and decarbonization, it has to be done at the regional scale, and not just at the Western Balkan scale. It has to be done at the Southeast European scale. And for instance, Romania is building a new nuclear unit. Bulgaria will be investing more into nuclear. This spare electricity will be exported to the Western Balkans to balance the grid. Greece has become a major player on renewables, and some of the market will be in the north. So what the EU needs to do is build stronger grids, interconnectivity, encourage cooperation, and the rest will follow, because there'll be a signal to market players to invest and to reap the benefits. And also I'm part of this group called BPAC. We have a survey. What you discover polling people in the Western Balkans, they actually, in general, favor cleaner energy, even if they ask to pay extra buck. And the truth is that actually going forward, green electricity will become cheaper and cheaper in this region.
As the investment grows. Thank you, Dimitar. Let's go to Meliza. Meliza, I've been dying to ask you this question. President Vučić from Serbia said that Ukraine is a quote-unquote friendly country to Serbia, and if it recognized Kosovo as an independent state, it would undermine its insistence on its own territorial integrity. How would you characterize the current state of relations between Ukraine and Kosovo, and do you believe there is a compelling case for Ukraine to recognize Kosovo at this juncture? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. I've been dying to answer and to get into this topic as well. Let's start by Kosovo's official support and unequivocal support after the unprovoked full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. It has been really unequivocal in condemning in strongest terms Putin's genocidal actions against sovereign Ukraine, and also in offering support and shelter to more than 5,000 Ukrainian refugees and journalists as well, and also enacting sanctions against Russia immediately after. So undoubtedly, what we're witnessing in Ukraine is a huge and painful reminder and resemblance of what happened in the 90s in the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia, and as well the Milosevic's bloody genocidal wars against Bosnians and Kosovo Albanians mainly. So Kosovo people and institutions wholeheartedly sympathize with the Ukrainian people, and this is no secret, and we've shown it without any doubt. But regardless of these facts, Kosovo also perfectly understands the role, the situation and the geopolitical context that Ukraine is in currently, and how bravely and resolutely it is defending the West's border with Russia. As I mentioned in the beginning, Kosovo is also considered as West's border with Russia and with Russian influence. So we practically have the same threats and the same enemy and the same strategic aims. So we both want to join NATO and EU, and we proudly and decisively belong to the democratic world of the West. But despite these facts, I also have to admit that it's not pleasant to see Ukraine not recognizing Kosovo and falling prey to Russia's and Serbia's propaganda and lies that considers Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and also recently the Kherson region as part of Russia, similarly as Serbia does with Kosovo. And we've also seen and heard Ukrainian ambassador in Belgrade reiterating that Ukraine respects Serbia's territorial integrity, which is in total controversial statement with their reality on the ground. So the truth is that both Kosovo and Ukraine are sovereign independent countries, and neither of them belongs to the Russian or the Serbian world. Now, while mutual diplomatic recognition might not be an easy endeavor now, I believe this should not be a barrier for both sovereign countries to increase cooperation and to intensify the political dialogue, as both our countries belong to the, as if I may, the newly strengthened anti-Russia pole. So I have also asked publicly my successor and the Kosovo government to start negotiating via its allies in opening a Kosovo liaison office in Ukraine to intensify this bilateral cooperation without pressuring in any way or asking Ukraine to straightforwardly recognize Kosovo. So let's start by increasing bilateral cooperation. We have liaison offices in many non-recognizing countries, and it has proved to be a very valuable instrument in helping cooperation on practical terms among the states that currently or for the moment do not recognize each other. So let's hope that this will be the case. We've seen President Zelensky as well meeting in NATO, in European summits, EU summits with the Kosovo leaders as well. And we've seen that there is an increased understanding among both countries. So let's hope for an opening, first in ending the war, and then an opening in bilateral official cooperation between Kosovo and Ukraine. We'd love to see that.
Thank you, Melissa. Spoken like a true diplomat. I mean, for me, what was interesting is that just shortly after the February escalation, there were many comparisons made, and I did hear people saying Serbia and in Bosnia, Bosnian Serbs specifically, who said, well, there's no difference between what Russia is doing in Ukraine than what NATO did in Serbia, but you cannot make those comparisons. Those are two very different situations. NATO went into the Balkans twice to stop genocide, whereas Russia rolls its tanks into Ukraine to commit genocide also. Those are important differences, at least from where I stand. Kurt, I'm going to turn to you again to share with us some of your wisdom. What is the likelihood that we may see the unfreezing of certain conflicts in the Balkans? How would that impact the Russia-Ukraine war? Thank you, Kurt.
Sure. Well, thank you, Leon. I mean, I've always had a problem with the term frozen conflict, not to be parochial, but it seems to downplay all of the conflicts were not something you just took out of the freezer and they thawed and they came back to life. It took a lot of effort to generate a series of wars, of which one in Bosnia and Herzegovina was the most sanguinary. There's the potential for renewed conflict without a doubt, and that's been evident for a long time. But that is precisely why the West built mandates to prevent it. And that is what's frustrating. We shouldn't even be talking about this. We used to have we should be talking about this in the current context because it's a real threat. But the fact that it's been allowed to become one, rather than having a credible deterrent on the ground, particularly in Bosnia, has created a playground in the Western Balkans. I would posit that Bosnia-Herzegovina is the central conflict reactor. If up until about 2006, Croatia and Serbia were pushed out of the equation, and that was absolutely critical. That when I arrived to work for Patty Ashton in 2005, there was no, people hadn't forgotten what happened, but there was no fear, unless you were a minority returnee, of a renewed renewed organized violence, because the presumption was we would stop that if it started, if necessary, by killing the people who initiated it. That's a credible deterrent. We don't have that now, and we're not willing to reinforce it, in part for theological reasons. For the EU, that would be going backwards. It would show that they failed for a long time, which they have, even on their own terms. But they try to paper it over by proclaiming progress. So we may very well see the launch of negotiate membership talks with Bosnia, which is an absurdity, because Dayton, Bosnia will never get into the EU or NATO. I want Bosnia and Herzegovina to enter those clubs, but it's going to have a completely different political operating system that's accountable. Otherwise, it's unsaleable to member states. So I guess I would just sum up by saying, this is a question of deterrence. I'm going to share my screen with you very quickly again, simply to point out a study that I will also tweet that we put out a little over, I think about 2 years ago. And it demonstrates the equation. I mean, we're leaving potential progress on the table in the region, and have for a long time, because there's enormous popular dissatisfaction with these regimes for most of them. And instead of exploiting that by taking the toys away of potential conflict actors, we amplify it. So I find it very disturbing that, most illustratively, and I'll drop it here, Vučić and Serbia should have been really on the back foot as of February 24th last year. Instead, it has become a really good earner for Vučić. He's played his political arbitrage game, geopolitical arbitrage game, incredibly well, because we've fallen for it. We want to believe, and we haven't ruled things out that give him leverage, and that's a huge. It's a policy failure. It's a protracted policy failure.
Thank you, Kurt. We'll circle back to that shortly, and that graph of yours would be funny if it wasn't so sad, unfortunately. Dimitar, I know you have a train to catch. Do you have a minute for a response on a question? Yes. Okay, perfect. And you can make it as brief or as long as you want. I know you've focused. I mean, you have your finger in many different pies, and you can focus on all things Balkans. But I know one of your pet peeves, of course, is also the issue of narratives and disinformation. Now, to what extent has Russian disinformation played a role in shaping public opinion and policy decisions regarding the Russia-Ukraine war in the Western Balkans? And how has the media landscape changed since February last year? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very relevant, of course, because in many of those countries, Russia is preaching to the choir. It didn't need to tell Serbian public opinion that NATO is evil. They believed it ex ante. One thing that changed is Russia investing in some channels. RT would be a good one, and you referenced it. But I think a bit more thorough research shows that as far as media outlets go, RT is way behind much else. It's not where your average Serbian viewer gets their news. It's the likes of TV Pink and TV Happy, and all the tabloids that echo government propaganda. And there's an interesting game of deniability, because formally this is not the government, these are private enterprises, but everyone knows that they are aligned with Vučić, not least people demonstrating every Saturday in Belgrade since May, since the terrible shooting happened. They're calling for accountability for those private, quote unquote, channels. So you have to look at them. I see a slight change in tone sometimes. Now that Vučić is quietly pivoting to the US, something that's been in the works. It's a long discussion, starts also with, let's say, suspicions or widespread suspicions that Serbia has been selling ammunition to Ukraine via third countries, which is not unlikely. So this causing up to the West has resulted also in the pro-government media not praising Russia to that extent, but actually saying Vučić is a very wise statesman. He's balancing the East and the West and providing what's best for Serbia. So that's where it's heading. But otherwise, the narrative is standard issues, like the West is undermining all those distant countries. Serbia has been a victim. Russia has been a victim. Now it's payback time. Russia and Serbia, Orthodox brethren. This one, I'm not sure how exactly it works, given that Ukraine is also a majority Eastern Orthodox nation, but the narrative is out there. So yeah, that's my long convoluted answer before I take off. You have to be really looking at the national channels. It's them spreading the narrative, and the key is in Belgrade. It's not in Moscow at the end of the day. So thanks a lot for a great event, and I'm sorry to be bailing out early in the game.
Thank you, Dimitar. We appreciate your insight. I definitely have tons of follow-up questions there, but we appreciate you have to go, and I hope to see you back around these Russia-Ukraine dialogue tables in the near future. Thanks, Dimitar.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. I did see, especially Kurt, I did see your expression after Dimitar mentioned the pivot to the West. So I'm sure you're going to have something to say about that. But my thought is always, you know, when I saw those reports about Serbia selling weapons to Ukraine, supposedly, whether that was with intent. Intent is really important. You know, is it some official, you know, that just sold those weapons to Serbia and there were maybe a few bribes under the table or something, or was there a particular intent to help Ukraine? I think that's really important, and I wonder whether that transaction would have actually materialized had it been made public. You know, I'm not sure if I really buy completely into the whole pivot to the West. You know, if you also look at these narratives, and I hope you may have some different insight on that, but Serbia has been moving further and further away from the EU. All the polls show the same thing, and President Vučić is not just, you know, as I often say, the thermometer, you know, reflecting the mood of the people. He's also a thermostat leader. You know, he sets the mood. So I think he's part to blame for that. But yeah, it will be interesting to hear from the two of you. Meliza, let me also ask you, in light of recent provocations, you know, with regards to this, what I think the only term we can use is a group of terrorists, you know, who were you know, stumbled upon in Kosovo. What has been the response from the European Union and the United States, and what notable challenges or discrepancies exist with regards to Western responses?
Thank you, Leon. It's clear that the West was very slow and obviously disunited to recognize early in the day the dangers of the silently boiling situation in the border between Kosovo and Serbia. So after the unprovoked Russian aggression unleashed in Ukraine, the West realized that the threat of destabilization in the Balkans is real, and it has clearly showed its teeth on September 24th. And I might correct you here, it's not just a terrorist attack, what happened on September 24th. It's a paramilitary crime of aggression. orchestrated, planned, trained, and executed by Serbia via its terrorist gangs in the north of Kosovo. So unfortunately, even after a month of this crime of aggression, we still have not seen a clear designation by the international community, by the EU and the US as a pact that this was in fact a crime of aggression, and Serbia needs to be held accountable, not only in dialogue with Serbia, with Kosovo, but also in other larger international contexts. Unfortunately, we're seeing a hesitant international community, mainly, and this is my understanding, mainly because of if designating Vučić and Serbia as an orchestrator of this aggression, then they might indirectly and directly endanger the already failed EU dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia. So they think that by, again, appeasing Vučić and turning a blind eye on what happened in September 24th in the Banska village and around the monastery in the north of Kosovo, they are silently allowing dialogue to continue flowing without accountability whatsoever for lives lost and for endangering the whole Western Balkans and, if I may, continental Europe of its stability and peace. So in this respect, by maintaining an open-ended EU facilitated dialogue, which doesn't have a clear timeline of when it will end, doesn't have a clear time frame of how the current agreements that exist will be implemented, and also doesn't have principles and goals on what normalization means. I don't see that Serbia will be, Serbia's destructiveness will be isolated or will be held accountable for whatever it does, and especially after what it did in September 24th against Kosovo. So we've seen the US clearly defining the goal of the dialogue. So the goal in the past, and it was expressed also via some letters that former and current president of the United States sent to the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia, that normalization means mutual recognition. While we've not seen the EU being so clear on what normalization means, and mainly due to the structural and political problems that exist within the EU, with the 5 EU non-recognizers in relations to Kosovo. So they cannot define what normalization means. They cannot define what the end epilogue of the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue is. So that's why we have such an undefined, lousy, and dialogue process without a clear mechanism that oversees the implementation of the current pool of agreements. We have 33 plus agreements, and also the latest one mediated by the EU and supported by the US in Ohrid just a few months ago. So while EU member states don't have this common denominator in relations to Kosovo, Serbia leverages on the Putin's playbook. So as Serbia is instrumental to Russia's campaign of malign influence in the Western Balkans, similarly, the undefined EU facilitated dialogue is an essential and central tool for Serbia to exercise and to maintain this double-hatted policy it has between EU and Russia. So this is the analogy. And in this context, being a neighboring country, as Kosovo is, and sitting in a negotiating table with the main Russian axis in the region, who also happens to be an EU frontrunner in terms of its EU candidate status, I think is a challenge on its own. And especially for a country like Kosovo, whose international alignment and integration direction has always been clear and one way. So, of course, Kosovo wants to resolve the last remaining issues from the wars in former Yugoslavia. The principles for the resolution are simple and clear, and this is what we've over the years demanded from the international community. So Serbia must acknowledge the fact that Kosovo exists as a state. And this is the main problem, because association of Serbian municipalities and Serbian rights in Kosovo is not a problem. We have implemented, not only on paper, but implemented the most advanced protective mechanisms, constitutional protective mechanisms for minorities in continental Europe, I must say, or in compared to other advanced democracies of the West. So we've implemented that. It's not just on paper. So Serbian rights is not an issue in Kosovo. An issue is the non-recognition between Kosovo and Serbia, the state of affairs between Kosovo and Serbia. And that's why, while Serbia has Kosovo in its constitutional order, still territorial part of it, and we see the West not pressuring at all Serbia to change its constitution and to accept the reality as it is, we see a totally asymmetrical approach of the West pressuring Kosovo, not only to have a new mechanism, which is the Association of Serb Municipalities, which is in total contradiction with the principles, constitutional principles that we've built jointly with the international community, the state of Kosovo, a mono-ethnic mechanism that has like pretended executive powers that will interfere between the current existing local and central powers that Kosovo has. So it's very problematic, and we've seen this asymmetry exerting its problems even now as we speak, and as we read news that the dialogue is reportedly being continued this week with a new meeting between Vučić and Prime Minister Kurti without having designated and clarified what happened in September 24. So this is a hypocrisy, and this will definitely end up in vain, because Serbia will still continue to do the same.
Thank you, Meliza. Yeah, and definitely the dialogue, the key issue with the dialogue is it lacks a goal. As you pointed out, normalization means nothing. It's not a term in international law, and many of the supposed agreements that are before us are also not true agreements. They have not been signed and ratified by both parties, you know. So there are many question marks there. Kurt, to wrap us up very briefly, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, what role has Western powers played in addressing or exacerbating the tensions within Bosnia and Herzegovina? I know it's a difficult one to do in a short few sentences.
We've exacerbated them a lot in the past 2 years in particular. There's a long tail to that, but with the election reform that was pushed through, that the High Representative imposed in 2 parts because he had to do it again to achieve the desired result, but also in the protracted deterrence failure. And we may very well get kicked in the teeth in the UN Security Council in a couple weeks when the U4 mandate comes up, because Russia can cast a veto. It's understood, but I don't think it's actually fully agreed, that NATO would pick up that role because it's explicit in Annex 1A of the Dayton Peace Agreement. But there was a golden opportunity to reinforce the force in a big exercise that took place in September, just by keeping the exercise troops there, at least as a placeholder until you could rotate more in. It's only at about 20 to 25%, depending on when you're talking about, of the deterrent strength that 3 DSAC years in a row said you need, which is a brigade, 5,000 troops. You're probably close to 1,100 right now. So it's this pacification focus that's applied region-wide, and Ms. Haradinaj spoke about that as well in the approach to Serbia. And Serbia is perhaps the biggest beneficiary, but there are a lot of beneficiaries to that approach. On top, with misplaced priorities on top. So we had a real opportunity after February 24th to shift out of the zombie policy that we've had toward the Western Balkans for a very long time, and we didn't do it. Still haven't. And it wasn't because we probably couldn't marshal Western unity for it. It could have been done if there was a will at the commanding heights in key capitals like Washington, Berlin, London, Paris. It would have happened if there was the will to do it. It's not a big political heavy lift. It's a bureaucratic heavy lift, and nobody's going to advise from within the bureaucracy because it's admitting that they've been failing, and nobody wants to tell their bosses that what they've been telling them is under control isn't under control. So it's deeply problematic. We've been making things worse because we haven't been living up to our responsibilities and even covering for our own interests, let alone the interests of the people in these countries. So it's been incredibly frustrating. I tried to encapsulate the calculus, at least as I see it, in this New Lines article that I'll tweet the link to after the webinar, looking at the American policy. But there is we've definitely been making things worse at an accelerated rate since February 24th last year, paradoxically.
Yeah, and it is sad because you should never fail to capitalize on a good crisis, as some would say, right? But in the absence of a concrete policy, and I would say both the US and the EU are guilty of this. I mean, the US says always, no, we want a Europe free, whole, and at peace. But what does that mean in relation to the Balkans, right? And so we continue to respond to incidents rather than, to develop a strategic policy that would deal with some of these issues once and for all. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists, Dr. Dimitar Bechev, Meliza Haradinaj, and Dr. Kurt Bassuener. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciated your insights on this discussion. I think the Balkans, of course, is not very high on the agenda if you don't follow things, but certainly there are certain developments happening in the region that we need to follow very closely. So as a Balkan watcher, I follow your work and your insights. Thank you so much for joining me, and goodbye.